The hallmark of grace is more grace. The word grace in Greek is the word from which we get the word charisma. Somebody who is charismatic, charisma, freely given grace, the gift of grace. Charismata is the plural. And this gives us the word charity as well, if you go through Latin. In the Christian theology, and particularly in John 1:16, from Christ's fullness, we have received grace upon grace. And that's the idea that the grace of God is something that replicates and is ongoing. It's eternal because it's something from an eternal being. It's eternal. Now, how do we end up with charisma? Somebody who is charismatic in a purely worldly sense. It's often seen as a form of leadership, an extraordinary leadership. It doesn't necessarily have to be good. Hitler was, by all means, by all judgment, an extremely charismatic individual. And the idea of charisma comes probably from the Hebrew word hanan, and the idea of being shown favour. And I remember meeting Mrs. Thatcher briefly and catching her eye. I didn't catch her eye. She glared at you. You were the only person of significance, even for that brief second, and you felt touched. Now, I can't say that I'm an absolute devotee of Mrs. Thatcher. I'm very critical of Mrs. Thatcher. But it's impossible to meet such a person without sensing the charisma that they bring. The same thing with meeting some of the popes. There is a charismatic sense. Now, is this something that comes with the job? Is this something that they have somehow or other acquired from God or from some other source? I would always have said yes until I thought of Liz Truss. Liz Truss demonstrates that it is possible to be Prime Minister without even the slightest hint of charisma, that the office does not convey charisma. The office itself doesn't impart that charisma. The office is not charismatic. And so it's not simply so being Prime Minister is not some sort of quasi baptism, transfiguration, confirmation. It isn't. And shaking hands, kissing hands with the Queen doesn't confer the sort of grace today that it might have done in the 16th, 17th century. A revered religious figure attains a higher perfection, a special charisma, the hierarchical, sacerdotal domain. But again, I've met priests and bishops. I remember the Archbishop of Athens when I was living in Athens, Christodulus, an absolute shit. But I mean, he was greatly revered by many people, but he was a racist thug. And I remember I went to him to try and get support from him for my partner, who was Turkish, who had been raped and tortured by the Greek Coast Guard. And Christodulus went on television that evening as a sort of response and said, "Oli Turki ni varvari," all Turks are barbarians. And I remember going to see him and being intercepted by an archimandrite who was quite charming and assumed I spoke only in English, and went through the pantomime of trying to talk to me only in English. And all the time we were being telephoned by a person who he referred to as Makariotita, which is the greeting, the way you address a senior cleric in the Orthodox Church, most blessed. And I said, oh, who was that? He says, oh, the gardener, which is absurd, but entertainingly biblical in its reference, as Jesus was identified as the gardener after the resurrection. So to be charismatic, you don't have to be you don't have to be good. And where do you get this personality, charisma from? I have no idea. I would say, if I wanted to be truly theological about it, that it comes from God, whether you recognize it or not. But it is something that emanates, and it is quite literally bewitching. It is deeply captivating, and people who have that gift can control an audience, whether for good or for ill. I think, to repeat, I think Mr. Farage is definitely one. Rees-Mogg is definitely, and without doubt, another. Liz Truss is definitely not one of those. Kwasi Kwarteng, I think, oddly is. Even if he's not talking about his prodigious package, he is extraordinarily compelling, and he also does the work. I think it's a great shame, in a way, that it was Liz Truss who was Prime Minister, not Kwasi Kwarteng. Maybe with Kwarteng in power, we wouldn't have had the mess that we're in. Even though he has the same views, he does the work in a way that Liz Truss does not. And Liz Truss assumed that the office came with its own charismata. It doesn't. She's demonstrated that. And her attempt to command the world stage is a feeble fizzle, because she lacks that gift. And singers, performers often have that gift, that sense that when you're sitting in the audience, in an audience of 3,000 or whatever, and you suddenly think, that person on stage is looking at me. And for a split second they may be, but it's the quality of that look and the way that charisma emanates, fills the room. And to go back to the religious imagery, to go back to the religious idea, the goodness of God is infectious. But equally, sadly, evil is infectious. And I can well understand how captivating was Hitler. I can well understand. I remember we had a school teacher at school who had an extraordinary facility for language and imitated Hitler, and it was bewitching. In German, it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary, the power that people can have over others. And we simply need to be informed. We need to be informed, and we need to judge. And we need to take note. And I think we should enjoy the power of the television remote control. I like to think that Farage is somebody I can turn on, but equally Farage is someone I can switch off. And the same thing with Mrs. May, with David Cameron, with all of these people. And indeed, Netflix, I think, have now got a television series showing us Hitler's home movies. Well, we can turn that off too.